So I'm Tim Smith, restoration ecologist at Cape Cod National Seashore and the primary project manager for this Heron River project for the National Park Service. I know there's a lot of people, or some people in this room who've heard this multiple times before, and apologize, and I'll try to make it as up to date and relevant as possible. So just to orient spatially here, we're in Wellfleet on the outer Cape, directly across Cape Cod Bay, about a 20-mile kayak ride or a couple days in a car in the summertime. This is in Cape Cod National Seashore. Historically, the Heron River here, all of the wetland symbology here on this coastal survey map was tidal wetland at one point, and at this time in the 1880s, there were two tidal inlets here, one at this place called Duck Harbor, and then here at the mouth of the river. And we have the main stem of the river here in blue, and several tributary streams going off in different directions. The tidal flow is supported about 1,100 or so acres of wetland. Today, this tidal inlet here is closed, has shoaled in naturally, so the longshore drift is to the south, and that just built up with the dune there naturally. But also the mouth of the river is also closed off by a dike that I'll talk more about in a minute. And then there's a bunch of road crossings across the river and the tributaries that also affect tidal hydrology. So this dike here, the Chequezet Neck Road dike, was first built in 1909, and it was built for mosquito control to drain the floodplain, dry out the marshes for eliminating breeding habitat. It was built by the town, funded by the town and the state. So here are some of the pictures of the construction and the early days of the structure. It was rebuilt in the 1970s. Tide gates that were placed in the structure back in originally had rusted open, and the gate the dike began to leak, and salt water started to flood areas upstream, so it was rebuilt. What we see there now is constructed around 1973. So on the left we have the bayside, Wellfleet Bay Harbor. On the right, the riverside, and even in this fill you can see the difference, the effect of the dike just right here with salt marsh on the bayside, Phragmites on the riverside. The effect of this has been, as you would expect, very, very dramatic. The hydraulic connection is 3 6-foot wide culverts with flap gates and 1 sluice gate that's only open about 2 feet high. So this produces this really muted hydrology. We have a 10-foot tide range in Wellfleet Bay and about 1.5 feet or so, or maybe 2 feet upstream. So the effects of this are predictable and pretty common, unfortunately, around New England. We have really dramatic changes in vegetation, Phragmites, but also because of other marsh and mosquito management activities, the former salt marsh has drained so much that we have upland plant species growing at salt marsh elevation. The dominant cover type in the floodplain is black cherry, which is a very much upland species growing at sea level or even below. We have buildup of fecal coliform bacteria that's led to closure of shellfish harvest areas on a permanent basis, acidic soils leaching into the water, really bad water quality from lack of flushing, the whole host of degradation going on here. So the solution here is to open up the dike to tidal flow to rebuild the structure, and also open up other parts of the river and floodplain to tidal flow. So we have a number of projects to rebuild or restructure these road crossings to restore tidal flow to one extent or the other. This is the main structure here, so we have the existing culverts on the top, and this is a rendering of the design for the new structure. So it's going from an 18-foot wide to 165-foot wide connection This 165-foot span was designed through hydrodynamic modeling, so this is the optimal or the smallest opening that would give us essentially the full range of tidal flow upstream. However, this bridge would be fitted also with tide gates. So these are just examples of the kind of modern tide gates that are being incorporated into the structure. And the idea is that it would be built essentially with a series of tide gates here, and over time, these would be open incrementally to the point where the gates are fully open and we have full tidal flow. That's the goal of the project. And these structures in the front of the dike are not integral to the bridge. They can be completely removed, and that's the idea that the gates and the framework, all of the infrastructure for water control is removed completely, so nobody can ever go back and close them. But that's an aspiration, not that's something far into the future. So why are we doing this incremental, complicated, and expensive approach here with managing these tides? So this project is really large for New England. I'll show some context for that in a second. Given the size of the floodplain, the duration of this impairment, there's a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if we were to restore tides in one fell swoop. And one of those major issues is a huge release of sediment bound in the material that's been entrained in the marsh, and having that flush out to Wellfleet Harbor all at one time is something we think we need to avoid. There are structures and roads built in the floodplain that need some level of protection. And having this control over tidal flow gives us the ability to incrementally restore tides and monitor those changes before we feel confident enough to move to a higher degree of tidal flow. And we can always, if something unforeseen happens, we can dial it back to a former condition to alleviate any unpredicted impacts, so we can make whatever adjustments that might be necessary. Because we have the structure, we have the ability to manage water for certain specific objectives, such as water quality or maybe sediment transport that we wouldn't have if we had no control over tides. And all of this was really crucial to gaining public support for the project. As you might expect, if you know the Outer Cape, it's a semi-rural kind of community, especially in the winter, small town. This is a big change, a big project for that area. So having this very cautious, conservative, well-monitored approach was really needed to get public support. The overall effect, when we are able to open the gates completely, the area in yellow is hydrodynamic model output showing the extent of mean high spring tide. So on the left is a tiny bit of intertidal area currently. On the right is the tide gates fully open. So we're getting intertidal flow to about 890 acres. Of that 890 acres, about 580 are 18 parts per thousand or higher, so essentially salt marsh. And we're looking at the frequent question is how long are we doing this incremental opening? And right now we're analyzing kind of the pros and cons of doing it in timescales between 5 and 25 years. So if you imagine you have this structure, you're in charge, you get to play with it, do whatever you want. You can be very aggressive, you can open it quickly, large openings go fairly short, or you can be very conservative, small openings over time. And they all have trade-offs. We have multiple objectives we're trying to achieve along with community concerns, so we have a very robust adaptive management program to analyze those trade-offs and balance the decision-making to have the best overall performance. And we're looking at that at 5 to 25-year timescales. So again, the context here, this is a list of the 10 largest tidal restoration projects completed in Massachusetts so far. equaling 440 acres. The Heron River project is 890 acres by itself, so it's twice as big as the 10 largest projects in Massachusetts to date. The largest projects, 130, 120 acres, so it's almost an order of magnitude larger than anything that's ever been done, at least in Massachusetts. The benefits we expect to see, this is again hydrodynamic output, model output, existing salinity, so the blue is high 20s, 30 parts per thousand. On the right with the project, you see we have salinity through most of the floodplain. This is the 580 acres of polyhaline marsh to be restored. I mentioned the fecal coliform a minute ago. So we have 90 acres of state-designated shellfish habitat downstream of the dike that's permanently closed because of shellfish, because of bacteria discharge from the dike, essentially being a point source. So tidal flushing, improvements of water quality would allow those shellfish beds to be reopened. There's other areas of shellfish habitat that would be improved. There's the town of Wellfleet is going through some nitrogen management, looking at this project to help with nitrogen loading in the harbor. The marsh accretion benefits, I think we'll hear a little bit more about, but certainly, essentially this is a carbon sink. We have huge areas of subsided marshes that have lost elevation, that haven't buried carbon for over 100 years. So we have this vertical space for carbon to accumulate, for peat and carbon, or carbon as peat, to accumulate as tides are restored. Lots of recreational benefits and other sort of socially driven factors. So the status here, we've completed our NEPA and state MEPA compliance a couple years ago. We're about to submit permits for the project. Design for permit is pretty much completed. Based on funding requests and things like that, we hope to go to construction and begin rebuilding the main dike and other structures in maybe late 21 or 22, and hope to begin restoring tides beginning in 22 or maybe 23. So just in summary, as a blue carbon project, you'll hear more specifics about where that is in a minute. So Scott is going to come up here and talk about this feasibility study. So the project team is reviewing that now. There's a lot in there, a lot to digest. So we're going through that, and the project team is thinking about how to incorporate this into the project. We don't really have more to say or have taken any specific actions on that yet. This is really complicated because we have multiple landowners within the floodplain, including the National Park Service, private land, private roads, funding coming from multiple sources. So how would a carbon project kind of work in that context? The National Park Service, my agency, is having internal discussions about how carbon benefits could be dealt with on federal land. I know other federal agencies have some experience with this. The Park Service apparently doesn't, at least in this region. So that's something that we're trying to get a handle on. And another challenge here is this long-term and incremental nature of restoration. We're not just replacing a culvert and boom, here's your new salt marsh. This is over an extended time. How do the credits accrue when the habitat is being restored a bit at a time over a long time period? And then the whole idea of becoming a carbon project and dealing with the VCS methodology. How are we going to do that? Get the resources and the funding and other things to do the monitoring and collect the data that would be needed on top of data we already need for the project in general. So we're beginning to think about the sources of funding and other resources where we might need to really develop this as a carbon project. So our work with the BWM project has really been amazing add-on or value to the Heron River project in a number of ways. From what we understand, this is the first effort to quantify the blue carbon ecosystem service at a large site in New England. We've developed this partnership with Quiet and USGS and NBL and the other people involved within the project, been able to apply some of the data that the Park Service has collected and integrate that with the BWM data and also bring the BWM data to the Park Service and the project to use for other purposes beyond just the carbon accounting. So I've mentioned this, a lot of the data that you heard about this morning from Megan and Kevin and others is very applicable to other things that we're working on with respect to water quality, sediment dynamics, and things like that. As far as the monetization of it actually being a carbon project, this is not likely going to be a very large amount of money that would sort of cover this project. I don't have a slide about the budget for the project, but it's about a $50 million project for all the things that we need to do. No one is expecting carbon credits anywhere near that magnitude, but if there were to be funding through a carbon market, it could be, it could cover project activities that are typically hard to fund otherwise, like monitoring or long-term education or stewardship, or things like that that are typically difficult to find resources for. We have restoration occurring on private land in small areas. There's some thought that maybe very modest payments from carbon funding could go to private landowners to provide some incentive for them to work with the project and allow restoration to occur on their private land. And then finally, even without a full-blown carbon project with monetization, just quantifying this benefit and the linkage to carbon fluxes and greenhouse gas changes is a way to bring in other supporters and other funders for the project that wouldn't really care too much about habitat restoration. We have a good handle, those of us who've worked in this field for a long time, we kind of know who is funding these sorts of projects from the habitat perspective. As I said, this is a large project, long-term, needs a lot of support and funding. So if we could broaden that field of interested people or interested entities who might be interested in funding parts of the project, appealing to this sort of greenhouse gas global problem, has a lot of resonance for a lot of entities. So that's all I had. Thank you.
We'll take one question for Tim while Lori switches over the PowerPoints to Scott's.
Tim, that was a very nice presentation.
Thanks.
Your point of being the first project to quantify ecosystem services, I'm wondering if within the MEPA process, the regulatory process, that you actually quantified the blue carbon accounting as part of that process.
That was just when the state started requiring that projects address GHG issues, and we didn't have any data to present at that time. But we did add a couple paragraphs just talking generally in a qualitative sense that we're working on this. And we're very interested in the state Global Warming Solution Act guidelines and goals, and you would like to mesh with that to the extent that we can.